compromised communication skills, degrees of impaired social ability, limited repetitive behaviors, narrow focused interest or special passions, and then sensory processing issues. And if you notice this, it's all based in deficits. So, sensory processing, communication difficulties and challenges and deficits. So it's really deficit based. And then disability and dysfunctional and disorder. So that's the medical model. And that's where a lot of clinicians come from, and first responders, who have trainings using the DSM-5, and anyone who's supporting people in crisis, and they have any training at all right now with autistic people, it's based on, the diagnostic criteria from the DSM-5. And so what it does is it looks at what's wrong instead of what a person needs. And what that does is result in unintentional harm. So there are many clinicians who don't even see the need to assess an autistic person for suicide once they find out they're autistic. It's like, okay, well, I'm involved in PCORI's $9 million award to find out the best safety plans for young people between the ages of, now it's 12 to 24. And I'm a co-lead on the clinician training team. So I've really talked to over 300 clinicians, and a lot of times they will say, well, we didn't even know that autistic people had this need. First responders do not understand ways to work with an autistic person in crisis, which is why I got into this advocacy work in the beginning, was because I had an experience with that, which I do tell later on in the presentation. And they're well-meaning, and they're, it's not like somebody is trying to harm anyone. They're supportive people. They're in, professions where they're supporting and helping people. But the behavior of autistic people can be misunderstood and reacted to in a negative way if it's not understood. So, and there's many, many ways to misunderstand, as you'll see as we go along in the presentation. But ultimately, what results is autistic people not getting their needs met. And it's not every time, but it's a lot of the times. And I hear from a lot of autistic people, just of experiences of being even invalidated, masking your autism. They don't know you're autistic, which is unfortunate, because then, they don't get the support they need. But there's no way for, the first responders to know, or the clinician to know if they're masking. So it's really a tricky situation sometimes in supporting autistic people in crisis. But one thing to remember is that unintentional harm by well-meaning, supportive people is still harm. So autistic people are still left feeling very vulnerable and unsupported and misunderstood when they really need help and support. So what an autism spectrum is not, is a disease that needs to be cured. It's not a personality problem. It's not a broken neurotypical person. A lot of clinicians, professionals working with autistic people kind of see autism as a neurotypical person with a little bit of autism on top, or a little bit of autistic traits, or more than a little bit autistic traits. And it's not that. You're autistic or you're not. And if you're autistic, you're somewhere along a spectrum. It's not bad behavior, and it's not Rain Man or savants. Not everyone has, this amazing ability to do different things, gifted or faking it or less than. An autistic brain differs from a non-autistic brain. Temple Grandin really did a lot of work. She has a really good book out there about it. Autistic brains using MRIs, they've seen that it differs in structure, neurocircuitry, and functioning. Autistic people are wired differently. And then a lot of people think, it's a linear spectrum where you have high functioning, for lack of a better word, and low functioning, for lack of a better word. But it's not really that way. And the little penguin type little characters on the top here, you have somebody with a little bit of autism on the right and somebody with a lot of autism on the left. And it's really not like that. It's more like the bottom picture where, they're just autistic, but the different things on the wheel is what changes. And that could be executive functioning, that could be daily living skills, it could be how well they can support themselves. Maybe they can't live alone. Maybe they have, maybe they're a professor at a prestigious college. Everybody on the autism spectrum is somewhere different, but as well, an autistic person can be different throughout the day. So I might be able to make eye contact and have, really good processing speed and, get things done in the morning. And then something may happen. I may be triggered or just, use all my spoons and doing something social. And in the afternoon, I can no longer do those things in the same day. And so it varies between person, and it varies in the same person between hours in a day, depending on what happens. So that really does need to be known when you're supporting an autistic person in crisis, because if you think, especially those who are masking, oh, they're just a little autistic. Well, those challenges that they have because they're autistic may be very difficult for them to deal with day by day by day, and in the moment when they're in a crisis. So it's really important to understand that. So when you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. So what worked for one person autistic person may not work for the next autistic person. And it may. So, it's really, you'll see later on in the presentation when I talk about supporting autistic people, you'll see that it's a matter of really asking the right questions, listening, and believing them as well. So when supporting autistic people in a crisis and suicide prevention as well, and some have chronic suicidal ideation, using their strengths is going to be key. And in order to use the strengths, you got to kind of know what they are. This is not an exhaustive list of strengths, but these kind of lead into supporting autistic people in crisis. So autistic people tend to be very creative. They're problem solvers, and that can be used to write an amazing, say, safety plan. They're honest. They tend to be honest to a T, and sometimes gets us into trouble. But that can be also helpful in, when you ask them a question, they're going to answer you honestly, most likely, and literally. And the reason why I say most likely is because when you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. Adhering to routine. This is very important in using the safety plan. If you can make it part of their routine, or even a list of reasons for living, then they'll use it because they adhere to routine. Also rule-based, which is in the middle here. This is also very helpful. So after my husband died by suicide, and 3 months before that, my nephew also died by suicide. And 3 months before that, I had a suicidal crisis. So in the span of 6 months, my family lost 2 people, almost lost 3. But in all of that, as I was, taking care of myself and trying to, keep myself here, I used rules because I'm very rule-based. And so one of my rules was if I was having some pretty heavy suicidal ideation and, thoughts, and really struggling, my rule was to just climb onto my bed and not get off until those thoughts subsided. And, I made it such a rule that it worked. And I had another rule where that, if I left the house, I would sometimes have to leave the house and walk. And so those rules I had from say, because there was no one at that time that I could really reach out to. So I really, concentrated on those. Detail oriented is another strength where, either making the safety plan or trying to, communicate what's going on for them. So these are very important to know for autistic people when you're supporting them, whether you're, like I said, making a safety plan for them, or you're making a list of reasons to live, which can be very helpful, especially when they're in a crisis and they're by themselves, in supporting them. So, but you also have challenges of autistic people. So the challenges here are all have to do with making it kind of difficult to support an autistic person because there's sensory issues that they may be experiencing. The environment can put somebody in a crisis, depending on, their situation. Executive functioning may be a problem in using their safety plan, or calling or texting the crisis line for help, or, just knowing what to do. Social situations can put them in a crisis. Communication is always difficult, and there's so much to do with communication as a challenge for supporting autistic people that we wrote the crisis toolkit, which I will be sharing today. Rigidity, cognitive rigidity, trying to move them into another thought process other than the one that they're perseverating on, which is the next thing. So, perseverating on a negative experience, or perseverating on their suicidal ideation thoughts can be difficult. That rumination is usually you're trying to solve a problem, and so you can ruminate on this problem solving, whatever the problem might be, but it could be that they're ruminating on, how their plan. So that's really hard once somebody's ruminating, to change that thought process. Change in itself can be very difficult for autistic people. Can put them in a crisis. Co-occurring disorders, there was a big study in Denmark that showed, and this study was over a 20-year period with, I think it was 6 million people that they either got data on or were in the study, and they found 95% of the autistic people in the study had co-occurring psychiatric disorder, with anxiety and depression being the top two. There can be a slower processing speed, which just slows everything down, and sometimes makes either crisis center workers or people supporting them think that they're done, that they're done needing help. Alexithymia is difficult because, it's hard to, alexithymia is the difficulty in explaining and even understanding your own emotions. So how do you feel? I don't know, is what might happen. And very, very difficult. It can make it very difficult for the autistic person to be able to say what's going on within themselves. And then sleep disorders, lack of sleep just kind of makes everything worse. So those are just different things to be aware of for an autistic person that you might be supporting. But as far as autism and suicide, what do we know? And why do autistic people even need crisis support? Research has shown that autistic adults are 9 times more likely to think about, attempt, or die by suicide than the general public. And if you look at the research on autistic females, it goes up to 13% higher. There was a study done by Cassidy et al. That showed 60% of the newly diagnosed autistic adults reported suicidal ideation, compared to 17% in the general population. And then 35 had planned or attempted suicide, compared to 2.5 in the general population. So it is one of the leading causes of death for autistic people without an intellectual disability. And that's important part too, is that these research studies have been done on autistic people without an intellectual disability. And that's where the high suicide rate is. And it's more like, you know, they don't have support by family or friends. Sometimes they're, you know, living alone, and they can do these things. They can get a college education. They can have a marriage. They can do these other things that make life, you know, livable and of high quality, but sometimes it's just unreachable with the challenges that come with autism. For children and adolescents, autistic children are 28 times more likely to think about or attempt suicide than the kids in the general population. And suicidal ideation and behavior have been reported in autistic children under 10 years old. So it is a problem even when they're young. So autistic individuals are significantly more likely to think about, attempt, and die by suicide than the general population. It's a leading cause of premature death in autistic people without an intellectual disability. Autistic people do have unique risk factors that have been researched and supported, but we need to understand any unique protective factors that may be out there. We have very little, if not, I mean, there's very, very little research on protective factors. So what do we know about protective factors? One thing is that understanding autism and the culture of autistic people, so autistic people do not have to mask their autism, that is suicide prevention. I believe that would be a protective factor. If they could be themselves in public without any kind of negative social ramifications. So if they could stim, if they could pace at work or in a social situation, if, you know, just being autistic was okay, that could be a protective factor. That same study in Denmark found protective factors of the general population were not protective factors for autistic people. That's pretty much what we know. So what are protective factors for non-autistic people are being in a marriage, cohabitating, you know, having a partner, employment, you know, having a job or higher education. These are not protective factors for autistic people. Marriage can be extremely difficult if you are, you know, married to a neurotypical person. You know, the communication for both parties is difficult. Just the environment sometimes in employment can be difficult. Never mind just being misunderstood, and you know, that's a big, that covers a lot. Being misunderstood by colleagues, by your boss, and then higher education is very difficult. I'm getting a master's degree right now in social work. I am an advocate, and I'm having difficulty in obtaining my master's degree just because, you know, professors don't understand why I might have to clarify their instructions. It's because my mind is very literal, and you know, if you read something literal that's been written with nuance, you really don't know what to do. And there's many other things. And I had a client who was a brilliant young man at Stanford University. He was going into the physics program, would have been a very, very valuable asset to that program. But when they found out he was autistic, he was not allowed in the program. And, you know, that really threw him, and he became, you know, in a crisis. So these are not protective factors for autistic people. The unique risk factors that we know from research are those co-occurring psychiatric conditions, where 95% of the autistic people in that big study were found to have anxiety and depression as the top two, but 95% had a co-occurring psychiatric condition. Lack of social support, just because, you know, this is social support, it takes social skills, and autistic people think, communicate, and experience the world differently than non-autistic people. So with all the later in life people now finding out that they've been autistic their whole lives, because just because autism, was introduced in the school systems in 1994, 95, and they really started to notice, autistic students and trying to support them in the 90s. That's not when autism began. Autism's been there all along. And so, I was undiagnosed until I was 48 years old. I know of some people who were diagnosed in their 60s and their 70s. They just lived a life of not fitting in and not understanding social situations and having this lack of social support. Number of unmet support needs as well. So I put these two together because they're really related. But asking for help is a social skill, making it difficult to reach out for help. They may not know who to reach out to, what to say, what to ask, what not to ask, what information to give. And if they do reach out, many times it is a negative experience due to misunderstandings. The first time I reached out when my husband was having difficulties, I had never, ever done that before. I didn't know how to do it. I was outside the building in tears and forced myself to go in to try to get some help. And when I, met with this woman and she was behind her desk and I told her the situation that was going on in my home, I don't know why, but she started laughing at me and said she'd never heard of anything like that before. And I got up and left. And that was my experience about reaching out to get help. It's not, I don't know where the communication gap was between what I said and what she heard, or what she understood, or what I left out. I don't know, but it didn't work. So autistic people can be unsupported for mental health challenges, employment, housing, education, relationships, for myriads of reasons. But all of those together is a unique risk factor of suicide for autistic people. And we have camouflaging or masking. And this is where it gets tricky for people trying to support autistic people who are masking. So what masking is, it's a strategy to fit in with peers, colleagues, friends, family, by masking their autism and their autistic traits. So they try and look and act like everybody else, and they're suppressing all the sensory information that's coming at them from the environment at the same time. So they may be making sure they're standing in the right place, and they're ignoring the noise, and they're ignoring the heat and the temperature, and they're ignoring, even sometimes colors can be kind of dysregulating, and they're putting on the face that everybody else has, and they're trying to keep up with the conversation they're not interested in or don't know much about, and they're just trying to not be themselves and be who everybody would accept by doing what everybody else is doing. The cost is exhaustion. It is so hard to do that and keep it up for a long period of time. The lack of sense of self, because, I think I started masking back in first grade, when I started being bullied, when kids really started noticing I was different. I knew I was different. I didn't know why. I knew that I did not understand what the other kids were doing when making friends. I had no idea how to do it. And so I started mimicking and copying the other kids and doing what the other kids were doing. I was starting to mask. But I didn't develop a sense of self. I just was doing what everybody else was doing. There's a lack of support, because when you go for support masked, you get support that would not be for an autistic person because you don't look autistic. And then you're not known for who you are. You can go to work for years masking and no one really knows who you are because you're pretending to be somebody else. Or, just go out for social, events and realize that, the whole night, nobody really was with you inherently who you are as a person, because you were pretending to be somebody else so you could go and be successful while you were there socially. It does help people. It does help autistic people socialize. It does help people have the job and get higher education and have a marriage. It is that social strategy, and it works. But they know, autistic people know if they took that mask off, they most likely would be rejected because they experience that in school and experience that when they show autistic traits. Hinders relationships because, it can be difficult if a person started a friendship or a romantic relationship with somebody masking, and then as they get to know each other, the mask comes off, and then their friend or their romantic partner don't even know who they are because they're becoming a different person, and that can get tricky. But it does lead to profound loneliness and not belonging. And so that it's a risk factor of suicide. Late diagnosis because of all of the above, and not knowing why you don't fit in, not knowing why you don't know what everybody else knows, knowing you're different, and just having so many negative social interactions, and then, the grief of finding out, well, what if I had known this when I was a kid? Would my life be different? Could I have made different decisions? Could I have helped myself in a different way? So there's a grief process being diagnosed later in life as well. Lots of female autistic people are misdiagnosed a lot of times with borderline personality disorder. And so not only do they are misunderstood and given the wrong diagnosis, but then they have to try to overcome that diagnosis to try to get the right diagnosis. And, that happens to a lot of women, and you can be extroverted and autistic at the same time. And, women tend to be really good at masking, although men mask too. So it's very tricky. It's very tricky to get a diagnosis when you're masking. And then autistic burnout, that's also a risk factor of suicide for autistic people. And what it is it's an intense physical, mental, or emotional exhaustion. It's not depression. It's just exhaustion in every way. It can be accompanied by a loss of skills. It comes from living in a world not made for us. So, just going out in the environment is hard to be in. And then you're masking all day long. And then you still have misunderstandings, and you still have communication struggles and challenges. And after a while, and also being invalidated, if you do venture out and try to disclose your diagnosis and someone says, well, aren't we all a little autistic, or you don't look autistic, or some kind of invalidating statement, can lead into, just knowing that you just don't fit in and no one understands. It can vary from person to person. Adults who live independently are especially affected because they are out holding down a job, and they do have relationships, and they do have possibly children, and it just can add up after a while. Camouflaging and masking play a big part in autistic burnout, and autistic people who are experiencing burnout have more difficulty managing their emotions than usual. And again, some autistic people don't even know what their emotions are, so it makes it even more difficult. They can be prone to an outburst of, either sadness or anxiety or anger or depression. Increased sensitivity to change, and change can be very, very difficult and can lead to suicidal behavior. So one example of change that I experienced, it kind of surprised me as well. Besides the fact that, my life changed in an instant, the night that I found my husband had died by suicide, that change was just huge. But eventually I got my family into some grief groups, and it was just other people with the same experience who would get together once a week, and different age levels would have groups. And so I was in the one with moms, and it was going okay. And every week we do the same thing. We'd sit in the same chairs and we'd talk, and I was getting to know people and everything. And then one night, after we had just sat down and, put our coffees or waters on the table and taken off our coats and just settled in, a facilitator came by and said, we have to change rooms and we have to join the other group because we're down a facilitator tonight. We don't, someone didn't show up. And so everybody got up to leave. And I just sat there and I was in tears because it just happened too fast. It was too fast of a change. And thankfully, there was a lady in there who understood I was autistic and understood autism really well. And she said, I'm just going to sit here with Lisa until she's ready. So there was no judgment. She just did that. She just sat in silence until I was ready, which was about 10 minutes. And then we walked over to the other group together, and I wasn't able to participate, but being there was a win because of being so dysregulated from the change of all of a sudden having to move and join another group with no processing time to figure out what that might look like for me. This is a very excellent paper if you want to know more about autism burnout. It was led by Dora Raymaker, and it's also in Autism in Adulthood. And so now I'm going to talk about the Autism Crisis Toolkit. This toolkit was written specifically to support autistic people who call or text crisis center, but now it's being used by professionals in different areas like clinicians, counseling, therapists, social workers. It's been translated into 2 different languages, Brazil, and I believe it's Portugal, are using it in their countries. So it has really become kind of really being used in a broader fashion. And before we go into the crisis toolkit, I'm going to tell my story to show you why we needed it. So my life changed on June 24th, 2015. And it really had to do a lot with sensory issues. And so I got a call from a neighbor. I had left the house with 2 of my children for safety purposes. My husband was just really having a lot of challenges. And so I was somewhere else. So I got a call to go back to the marriage home and do this wellness check on my husband. The police wanted my keys to let them in and do the wellness check. So they told me where to stand right in front of the garage doors while they went inside the house to check on my husband. What they didn't know was with my sensory sensitivities, I found out myself standing there right in front of the garage doors that my husband was dead on the other side, just a few feet away from me, due to my acute sense of smell. And so I'm trying to figure that out and realizing that my life is not ever going to be the same ever again. And my husband is gone. And the 6 policemen come running back out of the house, and they surrounded me really quickly, and they didn't know that they moved way too fast for me and my processing speed. And I kind of fell onto the driveway, and they thought it was the news, but it was them surrounding me. And so then before I could even try to catch up with what I just figured out and them surrounding me, one of them put their hand on my shoulder, and I didn't see it coming, and it was heavy. And so I didn't know if it was a threat. I didn't know what it was for. It scared me. And for months afterwards, when I thought about that night, that hand on my shoulder would just kind of haunt me. They led me across the street to talk to the police sergeant, where he started asking me these questions. To me, they were rapid fire, but I'm sure that they were just asked in a good time. My processing speed was so slow. My anxiety was so high. I couldn't make eye contact with him. I couldn't answer his questions very well. I was pretty sure he was thinking I was lying. And I wasn't. I was just trying to catch up with everything. And it was Florida, so there was high humidity. There was mosquitoes. The neighbors had come out. just because of what we were all there for. I was still trying to, I hadn't even had the chance to really absorb that yet. And that's when the victim advocate came, and she had a therapy dog, and she kept encouraging me to interact with her therapy dog, but I'm a cat person, and I have nothing against dogs, but they don't really help me, even sensory wise, with the panting and the, just drooling and just different things. Some dogs are really hyper. It's just a sensory thing. And I kept telling her I needed to pace, and she kept asking me to sit in her car to get away from the humidity and the mosquitoes. And I kept telling her I really need to pace. I was just trying to get my anxiety down. And she kept going from the dog to the car. And finally, someone suggested that maybe she get in her car to get away from the mosquitoes and humidity. And then I had neighbors out who were just, curious and who were caring. And I really was so trying to regulate, I couldn't make small talk. That was just another thing for me to do that I didn't have the resources for. And then I was asked to sit down to a meal, which I could not possibly do. I asked for one thing from the first responders, which was, I knew myself well enough that I needed to see my husband's body be brought out, and to make it real for me. And I'm very visual, and I needed to see that. So they blocked using the coroner's van and police cars and made me go across the street and blocked it off, so I couldn't see it. And again, that was not being mean. None of that, none of anything that happened was anybody being mean to me, but it was what I didn't need. And what I did need, I didn't get. And granted, I couldn't tell anyone either. I was just so anxious, anxiety ridden. So they handed me the keys. We started around 6 p.m. About 10:30, they handed me the keys, and they all left. And I was alone, and profoundly alone, because I felt misunderstood that whole night, and that nobody there, and there were a lot of people there, even understood what I went through. And I kind of knew too that they all felt like I didn't embrace their support, and I couldn't. It just didn't seem like support to me. So we needed to, have something to kind of bridge that gap. And so autistic people could feel supported in a crisis situation like that. So the purpose of the crisis toolkit is first to identify autistic callers who either don't disclose their autism or who don't realize they're autistic yet, but still are. And so they still have all the same challenges an autistic person would have. To promote effective communication, and then to support autistic people in crisis. So the structure is that first it explains unique characteristics of autism as far as being in crisis. And then it suggests practical ways to support an autistic person. And then it has a one-page bulleted summary to use in real time. So on the identifying and communicating part, it explains that an autistic person may express sensory difficulties to the person on the other end. And it could be somebody is supporting an autistic person in person as well, and they can express sensory difficulties. The sensory difficulties are unique to each person. It can cause a regression of skills if the environment is, just causing a lot of sensory challenges. That can be an identifying factor that you're working with an autistic person, and it can be why they are in crisis in the first place. They also may present with opposite emotions. So autistic people may present opposite of how they're feeling. So making assumptions about the seriousness of a crisis based on their presentation can cause a misunderstanding. And that can lead to miscommunication and result in just not being supported, because the call has been deemed ineffective. the interaction has, been deemed ineffective. So if somebody's saying if an autistic person is saying they're in a crisis and they smile or laugh, it really, for an autistic person, the words have to weigh more than the presentation, because there's so many reasons why they might laugh. They could be nervous. They could just not be feeling cognitively, like consciously, be able to say, I'm feeling this way or a certain way. And their wires could just be crossed. But if they're saying they're in a crisis, the words have to have more weight, because they have difficulty identifying and verbalizing emotions. So if an autistic person states that they don't know how they're feeling, that could be a very true statement. They don't know. And plus, how are you feeling is way too vague for an autistic person, because, there's so many different answers that could happen. And it could be. And that's not really a reason to stop supporting them. If it's if you're a crisis center worker or supporting somebody in person, how are you feeling? Oh, I don't know. Especially if it's a teenager and they do that anyway on a regular basis. It's really an invitation to problem solve and find out how they are, and try to find out in a different way than just asking them straight out, how are you feeling? They just may not be able to answer that question. A lot of autistic people, in fact, research has shown 50% of autistic people have alexithymia, which is the inability to understand and describe your own emotions. And so they may not say they're sad or they're disappointed or they're discouraged or they're depressed. They may not be able to say that. But they may be able to explain emotions in a different way, or they may be like me and not even know what their emotions are. My emotions usually come as a backache or a shoulder ache or a headache or a stomach ache. And then I know something's going on inside, but I don't feel emotions all the time. I can be crying and not know why, have just no emotion, but it's like, oh, something must be going on. It's really an interesting phenomenon. But trying to get them to explain their emotions in a different way could be helpful and supportive. So giving them time also to identify or explain their emotions. So, if it's a child, it might be, I feel the same way I did when I invited my classmates to my birthday party and no one showed up. For an adult, it could be, I feel the same way I did when I got fired from my job or something like that. They may be able to, not identify how they're feeling, but they kind of know what they're feeling. And they may be able to, trace it back to another instance that happened. They may be able to draw something. They may be able to, show you an emoji of how they're feeling. But getting creative and trying to figure out, other than just asking them, how are you feeling, would be supportive for autistic people. Autistic people tend to think literal, and so they can be very literal in even how they perceive the world and other conversations. And having a phone call or text makes it difficult for an autistic person to know if they can trust the person on the other end. And words are a way to build trust. So, for example, if you're on a crisis call or text and the person says, well, I'm here with you. Well, you're not in the room with them or wherever they are. You're on the phone. You're in a physical different place. That would work if you were in person with them. You are there with them. But an autistic person would take that very literal and say, well, you're not here with me. So can I trust you? Because this doesn't make sense, especially if they're in a crisis and they're having a regression of skills and they're overwhelmed and their processing speed is slow and their anxiety is high. That's really too much to try to figure out when you have a literal mind. It's going to go straight to the literal thinking. Misunderstandings and miscommunication. This is pretty much a defining characteristic of autism, is having trouble with social communication and social interactions. and it can be across multiple circumstances. So that's an identifying factor, that you may be talking to someone who's autistic if they're in a crisis, because so many different relationships have some difficulty or challenge going on at once or over time. It could be the reason the autistic person is in crisis, in fact. So, they could have had an argument with their husband in the morning, the kid's mad at them, the neighbor yelled at them, they went to the store and somebody ignored them. I've so many times been waiting in line and having the cashier, talk cheerfully to one person and then the next person and not say a word to me. And I feel like I have something written on my forehead saying, don't talk to me. And I'm not sure what it is, but it happens over and over and over again. So that could happen, so many different things at the same time, and they may not know why. It's an identifying factor that you may be working with somebody who's autistic. Relationships as well are difficult for autistic people, and it could be friends, it could be colleagues, it could be partner, it could be family. Failed friendships as well are common, and a lot of times, and many autistic people say this, and I've experienced it myself, you can have a friend for a long time, and then all of a sudden they stop calling, they stop texting, they stop making plans, and there's no reason why, and you can't get that reason why. So there's no closure, and you don't know why, so you can learn for the next one. This is an identifying factor and why somebody may be in a crisis. Also, sharing that it's kind of difficult to develop, and keep a friendship going. That's also something that a lot of autistic people are challenged by, and could be an identifying factor. Feeling disconnected and isolated from society. So many autistic people just feel like they don't belong because they're different. Differences in neurology can cause feelings of not being part of the society they live in. So, I felt that myself. I think kindergarten was my best school year, and the rest were just pretty terrible because, I was like many other autistic people. Kids can, chime in on the one who's different, and they start bullying them because they don't understand either. And, you can't really get out of that once you're in it. So you just don't feel part of society, part of your peers. So it can be deeply lonely and have just feeling complete alone. You can be with people and still feel completely alone. The environment is abrasive as well, and relationships are confusing, and language is culturally different. So many times, it's just hard to understand the social nuance of languages and why people don't say what they mean and mean what they say. I started working at a small private school about 5 years before my husband died by suicide. And when I started working there, there was a friendly staff member who started to say, well, as she left, she would say, I'll text you later, Lisa. And I thought, well, that's really good. I'll get to know somebody here, make a friend. And nothing happened. And I thought, well, maybe, she forgot, she got busy, that things happen. And then she said it again. I'll text you later, Lisa, as she was leaving. And I thought, well, good. Now this time it will happen. It didn't happen. But she kept saying it. So finally I said to her, because she didn't seem like somebody who would just lie. She seemed very friendly and nice and everything. So I asked her, why do you keep telling me you're going to text me and you don't? And she said, oh, that's me just saying goodbye. And so, I pondered over that, wondered about that, ruminated, perseverated on what could be happening with that. For, so much energy went into trying to figure that out day after day after day. And all she was doing was saying goodbye to me. And then you realize you don't fit into this world, because other people would have known that. And just so, it's thwarted belonging. And that is also, I didn't put it on the risk factors because it's not as well supported, but some research has shown that it is a risk factor, thwarted belonging of suicide for autistic people. Perseveration is rumination of thoughts, could be positive or negative, but in a crisis, an autistic person perseverating on negative thoughts may have great difficulty shifting their thoughts to more positive ones. And it could be perceived by the crisis center worker or somebody who's supporting them as that they're not listening, or they're refusing to cooperate, or it's being done on purpose because they just can't stop thinking about those thoughts. And if they don't know they're working with an autistic person who's perseverating, it can just look like they want it to go on and on and on, and nothing's working, and nothing they propose is helping. And that's why it's so important to understand, that it could be an autistic person, and what's happening is perseveration, rumination. Shifting the thoughts could be possibly done by knowing the person's passion, and possibly asking them about that and trying to get them to talk about that. That might bring them out. Otherwise, it's very hard to stop those perseverating thoughts. This is an identifying factor of you might be working with someone who's autistic, is they may have an uncommon way of talking. It could be pedantic or robotic. They may have a high vocabulary. They may talk slowly and carefully and pace their words, and that could be a processing speed issue. And there may be no inflection, and they may be void of emotion. And that has nothing to do with their emotions. It's just the way they communicate. So processing speed, we've talked about this a bit, and varying processing speeds are unrelated to intelligence. That's one thing. It's negatively correlated to anxiety. So the higher the anxiety, typically the slower the processing speed. So of course it takes autistic people longer to respond. And if you are a crisis center worker, or even working with somebody in person, asking if the autistic person is done with the call or text, if they haven't talked for a while, before hanging up would be really supportive, because I've been hung up from a crisis line. I know other people who have been hung up on a crisis line because they were processing and going to write back, and it just took too long. And I'm not talking an exorbitant amount of time, just more than answering right away. But to be supportive, asking if somebody needs more time would be supportive. And then there's echolalia. Echolalia is an automatic and effortless. It's actually nice, and sometimes it's enjoyable a lot of times, and repeating words, sounds, or phrases that somebody likes. So if you're on a call, it wouldn't really happen with a text. If you're on a call or in real life, and the person starts mimicking the person who's supporting them, if they don't understand they're autistic and they're, engaged in echolalia, they could think that they're mimicking and making fun of the person. And it's not something to take personally, but if it's echolalia, you can understand what's going on. If you don't, it's really hard to understand what's going on, because the person's copying you or mimicking you, and kids do that to each other, and it drives them crazy. But just that's why it's so important to understand and know these different things, so you can a supporting person can know what's going on. So as far as communicating, not using social nuances is really important when supporting an autistic person in crisis, because it's so hard, especially if you're in crisis, to understand social nuance. Sometimes it's hard when you're not in a crisis. A lot of autistic people have learned idioms, but they still don't know them all. And metaphors and just other kind of figurative language, it's difficult, especially in a crisis. Speaking purposefully and concisely. So say what you mean what you say, few words as possible, get straight to the point, is very supportive when working with an autistic person. You may feel like you might be being rude. You may feel like you're being really blunt, but what you're being for an autistic person in crisis is kind. If you can say what you mean and mean what you say and get straight to the point with few words as possible, that's kindness. And it's supportive. Honesty is very important for autistic people, just because we don't know. We can't pick up on hints. We don't know, like figurative language can be difficult. So if someone's just honest with us, that's what we understand. And that's many, many autistic people. And we tend to be pretty literal. And especially in a crisis, because we may be able to, go into those gray areas if we're not in a crisis. But if we are in a crisis and our skills are regressing on us and we are, our processing speed is slowing down on us, we're going to go right back to that, literal thinking, literal understanding, literal speaking even. So being supportive would mean to listen with a literal ear even, and not trying to see any social nuance in what's being said, but knowing that there's, someone's talking literally. So for example, if, when someone says that someone's in a pickle, that's a tricky situation, right? It's hard. They have a problem that's hard to solve. They're in a pickle. But for an autistic person, this is what they're going to think about. And what sense does that make? So, and this is just one example. When someone says, I'm going to go jump in the shower, why jump? Someone says they're going to go run to the store and the store is 30 miles away. It's like, that doesn't make sense. Why don't you drive? Autistic people can be very, very literal, and that's really important to know when supporting them. So this is also a really tricky part. Autistic people can have a very different inner experience than they present on the outside. So assessing an autistic person based on their presentation can be unsupportive. And then, you may have to assess them by a mode of communication, whether they are verbal, or they have to write something, or they have a card maybe that has their information on it, or they have an assistive device. But it's really important. Those words have to have the most weight. Listen to what they're telling you, even if it goes against what you're seeing. So for myself, the more in a crisis I am, the more calm, cool, and collected I look on the outside. Everything happens inside for me. And so, and then if I get into more of a crisis, I can lose the ability to communicate, to even tell anybody anything. But I can talk about the weather. So I can look perfectly fine and be in a crisis. And the only thing is, saying I'm in a crisis. And so many times, after my husband died and I was in a crisis, I wasn't believed. I just wasn't believed, because people are waiting for crying and pacing and, just an external, indications of being in a crisis. But autistic people may not, everything may be happening on the inside for them. It's very important to understand that piece. They also may be dealing with sensory issues, and they may withdraw, which is a coping technique. They may melt down externally, which would be that, crying and pacing and, kind of outward presentation of crisis. They may shut down, which is internal, and look fine on the outside. They may, just have anxiety, may dissociate. The senses may just put them in a crisis and have sensory overload, and then fine. But fine, presenting fine does not mean they're fine if they're saying they're not fine. So important aspects in helping an autistic person in crisis is, first, to build that trust. And with autistic people having a history of failed relationships, bullying, negative social communication, negative social situations. It's could be a little hard building that trust. But honestly, you know, being literal, getting straight to the point, using few words as possible, will go a long way in building trust in a short period of time. Try to let go of preconceived notions about autistic people and just find out information from the autistic person that you're working with the best that you can. Realizing that their processing speed may be slow, so it may take some time. Giving them space to regulate can actually speed up the processing speed. So, for example, I was on a 988 call and suicidal thoughts and ideation. And I asked if we could just sit for a bit in silence. Just having somebody on the other end of the phone was going to be supportive for me. And what I was told was, I can't sit all night with you. And I never asked for all night. What I was trying to do was regulate, and knew that if I could regulate and have that space to regulate, my processing speed would come up. But the person on the other end did not understand that, even though I had disclosed my autism. Communication, that needs to be literal, as straightforward as possible. And the environment, knowing that the environment could be the reason the person is in crisis. If you're on the phone or texting, suggesting that they may be safer in another environment, or if you're with them and you're, in a noisy restaurant or something, and they were triggered and they're, going into a crisis, removing them from that noisy environment could be supportive. So just understanding that the environment can play a big part in why a person might be in a crisis. Culturally competent support, and that just means understanding autism. These things in the different ways in the bullets is what I'm going to go through in the next few slides. So first, asking direct questions, being clear and direct, use few words as possible. Some people think the more words they use, the more they'll be understood. Not for autistic people. Using few words as possible, being that blunt, straightforward, getting straight to the point, is very supportive for an autistic person in crisis. And then presuming competence, because just because somebody can't tell you how they're feeling, can't communicate to you what's going on for them, does not mean that, they can't be a part of the problem solving. They need to be part of the problem solving. They know the most about themselves. And so helping you help them is the goal. But it is difficult because of all this, everything we've talked about up to this point. But presuming competence is important. And even in building trust and building, a relationship where you can help them, it's very important. Allowing extra time to process thoughts and formulate words. That processing time, processing speed, is, very tricky. So there is a way to ask if they're still there while respecting their need to process. Again, straight to the point. Are you still there? Can you still talk? I'm on the other end, and I, just let them know you're there. Ask them if they still want to be there, is a way to make sure they want to do this, but they're just processing. An autistic person can't hurry up their processing time. And if somebody does want them to hurry up, it's just going to make it slower. Helping to shift those perseverative thoughts. Again, talk about their special passion if you know it. Ask them what their special passion is to start the conversation. Could be something that they do that could be helpful, because the level of interest and focus on somebody's special passion is so strong, it could get them out of that perseverative loop. The unfortunate thing is if their special interest is why they're in crisis, maybe they couldn't get to do it, or maybe they can't find an integral part of what they need to participate in their special interest, and they're in a crisis over that would be difficult. But this is one way to try. Again, avoid figurative language. Figurative language is very difficult, especially in a crisis. for autistic people. Speaking words of logic is much more supportive than words of emotion. So staying away from, these words on the PowerPoint would be much more supportive than using just, factual logic words. Because if they don't understand their own emotions and they're faced with a question about emotions, it just may be very difficult to answer. And then if you're going to suggest positive coping skills and distraction strategies, like watching TV or going for a walk, it can be very supportive to explain why these coping strategies are being suggested. There was some autistic people that said they thought that they were being dismissed. They thought their pain was being minimized. They thought these distraction strategies were meaningless, but once explained, they were very willing to take part and try them. So just the knowledge of what a positive coping skill can help them with would be supportive. So for long-term support, helping to make needed connections with people or organizations and resources. You may have to explain, because they've never done it before, and it is a social skill, how to find the resources, what to say, who to talk to. If they're going to a place, how do they get there? And just any information that you can give for the autistic person to be successful, because making connections does require social skills. And it can be even difficult for an autistic person who is successful in other areas to be able to make the connections they need. And then, practicing what to say can be very important for an autistic person. Not just telling them, but like practicing with them. Practice making the phone call and you're the person that they have to talk to. To get the resources they need to keep them safe. And then, thinking about keeping them stable if the phone call or text is about to end, or if you're supporting them in real life and, that's coming to a close, make sure that they are in a good environment, that, talk about their special interests if that is helping, listen to what they're saying, even if it goes against, again, what they're emoting or what you think is going on with them. Listening to what they say will be very, very important. Trying to get them to, explain how do you regulate yourself, and, getting them to start maybe doing some of that. And then reducing access to means and making sure that their environment is safe as far as having access to means. So a support network, which is very supportive, they may not have one. They may not know how to get one. It's all in the social realm. So it's all social communication, social skills. They may be connected already. They may be not connected. They may need to reconnect. So having something there, like if there's a mental health facility in their town, or something available for them, does not mean that it's accessible to them. It doesn't mean that they're going to have success, because of everything that we've talked about, and having somebody there who doesn't understand autism. So having, giving them as much practice, knowledge, what to say, what to do, where to go, is very supportive. They may have no friends. They may have online friends, which people don't always think is good, but for autistic people, that's something they may only have. And so, supporting that would be a good thing to do. So trying to make one connection, at least right after the crisis, is a good thing. And then, having them try to think of long-term building a support network. And we are at Q&A.
Thank you, Lisa.
You're welcome.
So we have a list of questions for you, but I invite anyone who has some additional questions and was paying attention to the presentation to please get those into the Q&A button down on the bottom, and we'll make sure we ask these questions and get through as many as we can today. So Lisa, first question for you. If